What do you do with the information that you learn from the assessments that you give your students? Even if we're talking about end-of-unit summative assessments, we should look at the overall results and see if there are any changes we should make to our instruction. This is our own consistent way of doing action research in our classrooms. So in this episode, Wyatt Crane, who's a Spanish teacher in New York City, joins me to talk us through how he uses data from assessments, both formative and summative, to determine what is effective and what he may need to modify in his classroom teaching. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and every single time you click play, you hear me say you're an incredible educator because you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. And who does that? You do that. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your week to do this. So today I am speaking with Wyatt Crane, and he is a Spanish teacher at the Dalton School in New York City. And he's been teaching for about 10 years. And at the Dalton School, he is the middle school Spanish coordinator. And he has done his fair share of work in the regional and state conferences. He's presented at MAFLA, which is my state association in Massachusetts. And he has also presented at the NICEACE conference, where we actually saw each other recently in New York. He is here to talk with us about this whole idea of action research. Action research, what's that all about? So it might be something that you heard when you were in graduate school or undergrad or something like that. But essentially, it's really just this idea of finding a problem, dilemma, something you could be doing, your students could be doing something better, and then finding a way to work through a process of making that happen without just trying and seeing what works. So Wyatt is actually doing this quite frequently in his classroom. And we talked about it when we were at the conference together a couple of months back. And I said, I think this would be a great topic for teachers to hear about. We're going to hear specifically about what he does, but also just to plant the seed with you as a teacher to say, oh, maybe I can try some of this in my classroom and work with some of this and help my students as well. So, Wyatt, welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. It is an incredible pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Huge honor to be here. Very excited, longtime listener of the podcast and longtime fan of yours.
Just to give everyone a little bit of a history, I think we've known each other 10 years now. You had reached out to me to talk on Facebook about proficiency. And so we started talking about proficiency.
So first of all, huge shout out to you for being active on Facebook and being welcoming to young novice teachers who are like, oh my God, my mind was just blown about this whole proficiency paradigm for language teaching. Like, you don't just have to teach chapter 1 and then chapter 2 and then chapter 3. And I needed someone to explain it to me a little bit more than that. And in comes Joshua Cabral, who not only responded to my Facebook messages, but then was willing to come from the burbs into Boston over winter break. Digging through our old Facebook messages. And we sat down at a cafe for probably an hour and a half. And it fundamentally changed my understanding of what language education looks like, what assessment looks like, which we'll get into a little bit more in this podcast, and really kind of lit a fire for me in terms of, I think, a more dynamic and critical approach to that. My biggest claim to fame within the language teaching world is that back in 2013, 2014, I realized that a lot of us were talking about proficiency and proficiency levels and what novice mid means, what novice high and intermediate low, et cetera. And it was confusing. It was abstract language. There weren't a ton of specifics that you could sort of pin down and say, this really is intermediate low. This really is novice high. and in particular with students. I would say that as kind of talking to students about proficiency and helping them understand what it is that we're looking for and the growth that we're looking for, helping them to understand it. And so I wrote up a student-facing, student-friendly, ACTFL proficiency levels document. And I shared it in one Facebook group that I was a part of for feedback. I did not have my name on the document, unfortunately. People seemed to like it and seemed to say, oh, this is something I can't wait to share this with my students. This seems really nice. I got some good feedback regarding some nuances between the different levels. A couple of days later, I then start getting messages from people saying that they have now seen this document show up on the Florida language teaching Facebook page and the Central States Facebook page, all pushing this out. And at this point, it was still unattributed and didn't have my name on it. And so it was not once, not twice, but 3 times at different conferences where I was at sessions and someone showed this document. If your listeners have seen it, it referred to different levels as things like novice high was the fighter, intermediate low is the creator, intermediate mid, the explainer, and it had fun little clip arts to go with each of these levels. And at 3 different sessions, the presenter brought these up and said, these are a great way to explain to your students. I don't know where they came from. I would love to find out. And 3 times I had to raise my hand and kind of say, like, yes, all right, I'd tell my students to write their names on their papers all the time. And I sort of failed to do that in this particular instance.
You were definitely a pioneer with helping us to reframe what that looks like. And that really speaks to the way you teach and with your students, that you are very student facing. Like, everything is, how does this work in my classroom? And when we look at any research, anything about comprehensible input and writing, it was all done somewhere, that research, and they had these findings, but there's a very good chance, almost 100% chance, that they were not your actual students that you teach in your demographics, in your school and everything. So I love the fact that even back then you said, how can I take this and make it work for my students? And so our topic today, in talking about action research, I can see that you have really taken that and you're running with it and you're doing even more with it. So what was it that sort of first prompted you to engage in doing action research or doing something to help modify your teaching and your students' learning?
I would say very much what you spoke to there, in terms of there being a lot, a good amount of research out there on language acquisition. Obviously not as much as any of us would like, but insofar as you start to dig into it, you realize that oftentimes these studies are done with limited sample sizes or with limited demographics, and demographics that oftentimes are very different from your own. A few years ago, I remember talking with a more senior teacher at my school who does a lot of good teacher training work. He emphasizes the value of feedback, having processes of feedback through which they can engage with the work that they have done, revise work that they have done, rethink about it. It can be low-level mechanical stuff, and it can be higher-level sort of more big picture things in their work. And there is a good amount of research that indicates that giving feedback and giving specific feedback and informative feedback to students can actually be one of the most effective things and most transformative things that we can do as educators in terms of accelerating that growth or accelerating that learning. And I wanted to investigate the extent to which that can work in a language classroom. And as I started looking into research specifically around written corrective feedback, so essentially taking writing samples and highlighting, these are things that you're doing well, these are things that you could work on. I started reading, looking into the literature on this. It turns out it is very fraught and dramatic. There's a period of time in the late 90s and early 2000s referred to as the corrective writing wars, kicked off 1996. John Trescott, professor of English in Taiwan, who wrote The Case Against Grammar in L2 Writing Classes, claimed, quote, grammar correction is ineffective and potentially harmful and should therefore be abandoned. It was a very strident claim. A lot of practitioners and researchers ran with this. And it wasn't until 5 or 6 years later, Dana Ferris at UC Davis said, actually, hold on a second, the jury's not out. We don't have a lot of information. It turns out that what you're basing your information on is limited in scope, and essentially called for more robust investigation, which kicked off a series of papers around the world from different institutions looking at written feedback, looking at different types of written feedback, and trying to gauge at first just whether it contributed to better products in terms of whether a student revised their work on a writing task, and then if it was better, which it obviously was, but then John Truscott, the original guy of the case against grammar writing in L2 in LT writing classes, he said, well, what we're looking for is long-term learning. We need to prove that doing this on one task then transfers into future tasks. And that then became a major focus of research, I'd say in the late 2000 aughts to early 2000 teens. And the jury is out. Some studies have shown that it can be very effective in terms of giving those transfer skills, in terms of, giving a different writing task months afterwards, and having gone through that process of feedback and revision being effective. And other things have been less so. And so I wanted to look into this and get a sense as to if it is an effective practice for my classroom and my students.
So then you took this research, which there's always differing views with research, and it's rare that all the research is going to say the same thing. So you found these differing opinions, and then you said, okay, what is this actually going to look like in my classroom? Like, how can I do this in my classroom? So what ended up being sort of your research question that you used as you went into this action research about writing with your own students?
On the question of accelerating growth, it was, can engaging in processes of feedback and revisions accelerate proficiency growth? And that kind of getting at the core of how can we maximize learning under our control or in our classroom. How can we really kind of push to maximize that?
So I know teachers want to know, and if I were a really good podcaster, I would say you have to wait to the end to hear what the results are, but I just personally can't wait that long. So could you tell us, we'll talk about your process, but what have you found in your own action research around writing in your classroom?
There are trends that indicate that my students who revise their work more end up showing some gains in their proficiency, and they're able to transfer that from one task to the next. And so students, for example, who are, when I give them a homework back with them and I point out things that they did well and things that they could do to improve it, that students who are internalizing that feedback and enacting it and then resubmitting it are showing quality gains in then larger performance assessments. And I'm seeing trends that indicate that for my students, both with writing and a little bit with their speaking as well. And this kudos to you that when I saw you speak at the Nice Ace conference a couple of months ago, and you talked about Krashen's region with Stephen Krashen's research, you talked about how we sometimes forget about the monitor hypothesis and this notion of the majority of proficiency happening below the surface, but there being a piece that is happening at the front of your brain.
Yeah, so just to clarify, in case anyone listening, they're not familiar with the monitor hypothesis, because when people talk about Krashen, they don't often talk about this because they're so focused on comprehensible input and the target language use, but it's a 5 or 6 step part of his entire hypothesis, and the comprehensible input is just one of them. And one of the sections is the monitor model, whereas the vast majority of language acquisition is subconscious, that the monitor is the conscious part, where it is effectively acting as a filter, monitoring the language that's coming out of the subconscious, that if you consciously know the rules, you can self-correct it as it's going out. But it's still saying that it's starting from a subconscious place, but it can be filtered out and polished through the conscious knowledge of rules. So when you're talking about these trends that you're seeing in students, this is in response to what kind of feedback that you're providing to them?
The research indicates that feedback, it should be balanced, and it actually indicates that positive feedback, saying these are things that are right, you're on the right path here, can actually be more effective than negative or correctional feedback. So I try to give a balance of both. I try to highlight when students are using more advanced vocabulary, when they're using good connective words, when they're linking ideas effectively. And also a part of this is that mechanical side or that grammar side, where I highlight, we're working on maybe nosotros forms to talk about what we do at school collectively. And here I can see that you're using those verbs well. And then on the corrective side, because I do see that as a part of it, highlighting things that they're not using well, that where I know that we have gone over this, and pushing that metacognitive, that metalinguistic, maybe that that monitor component of their brain to recall within the context of their communication, within the in this case, within the context of their written communication.
And you're seeing transfer of that to their speaking as well?
I'm seeing some evidence that students who are doing that, and the theory would be that they are then developing that monitor skill, and that monitor skill can take place in writing, and it can also take place in their speaking as well.
We get in our trend of teaching and we focus on the 10% that's not accurate and not the 90% that is. And just the way you put it, that there's that evidence for the positive feedback being so beneficial as well. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, and it's hard too because we're tired and we don't always have time, and you want to just focus on, okay, fix this, fix that. But if you can give a little bit more time into each thing that you're looking at, into each product, I think that emotionally speaking, students will feel that you're there supporting them and you're noticing the good work they're doing.
When it comes to this whole idea of action research, so the basic tenet of it is that we are gathering evidence and that will then implement change in our practice based on the evidence that we get, right? So we're looking at, you plan something, you put it into action, and then you do an analysis of what happened, and then you make your conclusions and change from there. So we talked about your plan, that you wanted to see if this corrective feedback, saying that it's beneficial for students, and then you put it into action where you started doing this. And then what data were you collecting, and then how were you analyzing that?
I would say, we as teachers, we collect data all the time. We collect data on, have you done your work? Sometimes, what was the quality of the work? And quality measurements can mean different things on different assignments and to different people. With this particular project, I've just on top of, kind of keeping track of students' performance on various assignments, I track if there was an opportunity to revise and if they revised. And that revision process, I either do this through paper homework assignments and I oftentimes, I'd say my most common grade, much to my students' chagrin, on a homework assignment is a 4.5 out of 5, which mathematically speaking is a 90%, which is like pretty good. But oftentimes, at least with my students, they're shooting for something a little bit higher. And so that is, in a way, a way to motivate them without compelling them to revise. It's a way to motivate them and see if they can develop that habit on their own and see if they can come to it on their own. And so then I track who has completed those revisions, and just in an Excel spreadsheet at the end of now these past couple of terms, I've looked at various assessments and I've compared that to the number of revisions that students did. And the data is messy. The data, it's imperfect. And there are absolutely cases of students who do very few revisions and who show pretty solid or impressive language growth. And there are some students who do a good number of revisions and aren't showing that growth. And so this is absolutely an imperfect science. The general trends that I'm seeing with my students is that more revisions contributes to better performance on these summative tasks. But the main crux of at least this piece is who's revising their work, who's resubmitting it, and then how are they doing on our performance assessments.
And so one of the whole reasons we go into doing any kind of action research is because it will then inform our teaching. The entire process is formative for our teaching. So what have you done or continue to do or modified in your own teaching based on the results that you've seen?
I've continued to do this because I'm excited at least by the initial findings. And so I've tried giving students more opportunities to write and get feedback on their writing. I've started framing homework as I asked my 8th grade students this year. I said, why do we give homework? What's the purpose of it? The best answer they gave was practice. And I said, yeah, like that's a piece of it. And depending on the discipline, I think that getting more practice is not always going to make you better. If you're practicing wrong, over and over, then it's not necessarily going to improve performance. I said that every time that you guys complete a homework, that is an opportunity to gain feedback. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is that it's really nice as I start thinking in what I would say is a fairly critical way when I'm looking at students' work, I look for trends. And sometimes it will be a grammar-based trend. Sometimes I'll see that we're not using a certain verb or a certain form effectively. Sometimes, though, it's more about phrasal use. It's more about vocabulary use.
So I think the whole process of doing sort of research in our classrooms and the true researchers, like there's a reason why classroom teachers aren't doing the real in-depth statistical research, is because it takes a ton of time and resources, and that's why university people do that, and we are the teachers that use that. But I still think, though, that there is certainly a place for being reflective on our teaching, and what you're showing us here is not the sort of research that's going to be published and put out there and peer reviewed and all that. That's not what action research is. It's very particular to our own students. And the thing is, it doesn't have to work for another teacher. It doesn't have to work in another place and be replicated and all that, because this is really about your students and your teaching and what works in your situation. And so I think that's just really important for teachers to hear, that take an opportunity to look at what's happening in your own classroom. And I mean, we're calling it action research. During my graduate school days, we always referred to it as praxis, because it didn't have that word research on there, but it was sort of the looking at the results of your teaching and in a formative way, and then modifying your teaching based on the results, and now we're calling it action research. So it puts a little more of that statistical part on it. But what I was hearing as you were talking is, yes, your students are gaining in their proficiency and their writing competency based on all of this. But what I was also hearing is what you have gotten out of it as a teacher, that you got confirmation about the validity of how you were providing feedback. And I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong here, that you honed your feedback skills through this process, in addition to actually helping students in this action research. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you are a fan of teacher hacks, and anything that can help you, do the things that you care about and do them faster is great. And so I'm a huge fan of Google Classroom, and a lot of my students' homework is submitted over Google Classroom. Sometimes I use pencil and paper, sometimes I use Google Classroom. I think having a mix of both is good. On Google Classroom, the number of, I would describe them as hotkey comments, where I know how to pull up the comment option, and then I have a bank of probably 30 different comments, and I just have to type a keyword for the comment, and then I hit go, and it allows me to speed it up. And I think it allows me also to think about the different kinds of things that I want to look for. And going back to what I was saying before, also having a bank of those positive things that I want to say, as well as the more corrective things that I want to be including. And having all of those at the tips of my fingers makes this a much less onerous process than it could be.
Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping that teachers are seeing this as an opportunity to find those places in their teaching where they want to be introspective and figure out what actually works for my students, and to have a process behind it, to not just sort of just try it, see if it works. And if it works, do it again. And if it doesn't work, don't do it again. I mean, that's usually all the time we have as teachers, but to have a little more process and methodology behind it. So I'm curious to know where you are continuing to find your inspiration from as a teacher that you could recommend to us, because clearly if you are reading articles on teaching and everything, you're staying very inspired. So where's that coming from, and what can you recommend to us?
So I would say two things that motivate me. One, the Apple test. My school has we have rolled out testing for sixth graders and eighth graders. We are very fortunate that our students start taking Spanish in kindergarten, and that then continues up for many of them up through eighth grade. And so we determined that sixth grade and eighth grade were good times to be assessing them. And our students in sixth grade take Form A, which is more of a novice intermediate test. And then our eighth graders take Form B, which is more of an intermediate up to advanced low test. And it gives you professional feedback as a teacher in terms of how your students are doing. It gives students good feedback as well. But I am a fan of getting some kind of feedback on not just giving feedback, but also getting it and seeing how my students are doing based on other metrics or other assessors. And I find that to be motivating in terms of recognizing, this is a communicative mode in which my students are doing pretty well. This is a communicative mode in which we're not doing as well. And so that for me has been a good motivating piece. One resource that I really like is a website called Adios Textbook. It was written by Kara Parker and Megan Smith. And they have essentially set out to designing thematic units geared towards different proficiency levels, starting at novice low, working all the way up into advanced levels.
What are some ways that we can be connecting with you, Wyatt Crane, on social media or wherever we might want to connect with you to talk about action research or anything language teaching? Because that's whenever I see you, you just want to talk about language teaching. So how can we connect with you?
Yeah, I'm a big nerd about these things, and I appreciate connecting with fellow nerds. X, formerly known as Twitter, at L Senor Crane. It should be Senor, but they didn't let me include the Enye. So El Senor Crane is the best place to reach me to talk about these things.
Excellent. And I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice. This could be about your process of doing action research in your classroom or teaching in general. So what can you leave with us?
One thing that it's taken me years to be able to sit comfortably with this on the subject of giving feedback, that I think it's important to be welcoming of feedback and to be open to receiving feedback as well, and maybe even solicit it. And so I've started also in the past few years, I have a simple Google form that I give to my students at the end of every unit saying, did we feel like we learned? Did we feel like this helped us improve our Spanish? What were favorite things that we did in this unit? What were things that we could do without? The Apple, I think, has been, it's required a little bit of engagement with insecurity around, are my students hitting the levels that I think they are and that I've been telling them they are? But ultimately, I think these are things that help me in the long term become, over time, a more effective teacher, more targeted teacher.
Thank you for all of that and for just giving us this opportunity to focus in on being inspired as a teacher to look critically and introspectively at our teaching. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Joshua.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Wyatt Crane? I'm feeling motivated to look a little more closely at data and trends among my own students. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Wyatt. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. You'll also see links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together. We can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.